Hi, this is Bob Scully, and welcome to another edition of the World Show, Entrepreneurs, the Dobson Series. This week, a real estate entrepreneur. But there's real estate, and then there's real estate. You're going to meet a man who can buy the equivalent, the Canadian equivalent, of the Merchandise Mart in Chicago, something almost as big, and something that's in a dilapidated state. He'll take the big risk, make the big bet, take that building, and transform it into something hugely profitable. But it takes nerves of steel to do that. You have to be calm and collected, and as you'll see, he certainly is, and he has a lot of judgment to boot. Here's Richard Hylands. Richard Hylands, I find you at the obviously at the apex of your career. You've got these huge, prestigious projects going, and it seems like you can assemble them on a table like a Lego set. But I'm sure it began more modestly, right? Real estate is something you build, literally and figuratively. How did you get your start?
Well, basically, it starts off by going to a good school. And I had the opportunity after university, where I had done a real estate program at McGill, to work in Toronto with Cadillac Fairview, which at that point in time, the Canadian real estate developers, whether they be Cadillac Fairview, Olympia, New York, Oxford, were the big developers throughout North America, whether you were in Dallas, Texas, or whether you were in Toronto, or whether you were in Minneapolis or Los Angeles. The Canadian developers had the backing of Canadian banks, which allowed them really to be able to do big projects. And they were great schools. I mean, you learned a lot, you learned the ropes, and so I had the opportunity of doing that for 6 years. And, we went through a recession at the beginning of the 80s, and we lived through that recession. And actually, we lived through a few more afterwards.
Yes,
but
I was going to say.
At least we did a few cycles. And working in that type of environment allowed us to, see a lot of country, a lot of cities, a lot of different ways the cities were put together, and touch a lot of projects. And in the mid-'80s, I came back to Montreal and basically put that to work here locally.
And when you say big projects, it is fun to work on those big things, and it is fun to have big backers, but there's big risks too. I'm thinking back to a famous Canadian entrepreneur I talked to who had, at one time, lots and lots of real estate interests in the U.S., and one day he went down to Houston to see some friends, but he also took the time to inspect some of these skyscrapers that he had a stake in. And he sort of noticed they were all for rent, and nobody had told him this. And he starts sniffing around, and he saw that it happened in many cities. And lo and behold, he dumped his properties, and he was very wise to do so, because a few months later it crashed. So what do you do when you build a big thing like that? You can't be sure you're going to have tenants to the size of it, to the proportion of it. The risk is huge, isn't it?
Well, in the early 80s, it was very different. Houston was a huge disaster, and Cadillac Fairview had a 35-city block development in Houston, and it was called Houston Center. And it went through all of the problems that you're describing right now. I mean, it had no office tenants. The retail development didn't work well. The hotel, which was a Four Seasons hotel, had many leasing problems and occupancy rate problems. The Canadian banks at that point were doing something which was called bank guaranteed bonds. So what you could do is raise as much money as you wanted by simply paying a fee to the Canadian banks to guarantee your bonds. And that created a lot of limited discipline in the marketplace, whereby people were not worrying about pre-leasing or pre-selling or their projects, and basically they were starting them on a speculative basis.
And the bank was holding the bag.
Well, the bondholders were the ones that were on the first line, and Olympia, New York, when they went into Canary Wharf in London, I mean, we saw what the downfall of their bond structure did. But the reality was that a lot of these people did struggle through and ended up making successes of these projects that were done, because at the time, even though they may have taken a long time to lease up, they were still the premier buildings in those cities. And with time, they came into their own, and those ones didn't really go through too much of a bad cycle. But as long as they got leased before the recession of the around 1983, 84.
Yeah.
But that kind of disappeared very quickly. I mean, the banks got into where they could not hold any real estate themselves in Canada. They limited the amount of real estate risk they took afterwards, after the Olympia in New York downfall.
Yeah.
And so a lot of discipline came back into the marketplace. And even in cities in Toronto, you saw for a very long time there was no new buildings built till this recent development cycle. And the same thing was done in the States also. A lot more discipline came in, a lot more pre-leasing was required, or pre-selling of residential units, or simply that the risk of the project was much more manageable in size. Instead of being a 1 million square foot building that was built on speculation, it was a much smaller building.
And how much truth is there? You know the old saw, and people quote it all the time: "Build it, and they will come." And that was the guy in Vegas. I think it was Bugsy Siegel who said that. And boy, he was proven right. But you need time for that. Build it, and they will come one day. But I guess you need deep pockets if you're going to go by that philosophy. If you have a premier building and it doesn't do well at first, one day it will do well, but it may cost you a fortune.
But there are some that never made it well, and they were knocked down. I mean, we had one, for example, here in Montreal, in the east end of the city, a major shopping mall, which was in the Rivière des Prairies. It was humongous. It was 600,000 square feet. Could never lease. It ended up being bulldozed down.
Really?
And that was, financed by the TD Bank here in Canada, and that was probably one of their worst loans that they ever did in real estate in Canada. It was a disaster. So it does work as long as you're in the right location and the right product, but a flawed product in a good location may not work, and a good product in a flawed location won't work. So I mean, you got to put the elements together, and you got to put together all the pieces of the puzzle to make sure it comes together properly.
So it's build it and pre-lease it, not build it and they will come.
Well, we for example, here in Montreal, we acquired with Goldman Sachs in 1998 Place Bonaventure.
Yeah, which is huge. It's like the Jacob Javits Center.
Exactly. It was a 3 million square foot building that was basically copied in the 60s off the model of the Kennedy building in Chicago, which was a trademark building.
Which is still there.
Which is still there, but it's also evolved into other uses. But basically that building never worked in Montreal. I mean, it was a trade show building that was basically went bankrupt very shortly after, or repossessed by its lender very shortly after it was built in 1966. And when we acquired it in 1998, it was basically empty, and it had never was successful. And
despite being a beautiful, I want to say this for the viewers who are not familiar, beautiful building, huge floors, nice connections to the train station, hotel,
subway,
great location, and yet you're right.
Well, the floor plate was 250,000 square feet, so one floor is the equivalent of 10 floors of a regular office building. So it was made very much on the horizontal. There was no windows to the outside because it was a trade show building. But when we acquired it in 1998, we acquired it for approximately $36 million. That building, basically, we rethought it out. We started from zero. We said, great, it's got concrete, it's solid. We went in and put in windows. We basically went after tenants with big floor plates, and we basically remarketed, repositioned the whole building, whereby the building is now worth 10 times what we originally paid for it. And it's fully leased. There's no vacant space in the building. So you can rethink a thing. As I said, it was basically a fantastic location, but it was the wrong product at the time.
So you did a bit merchandise, Mark. Now that you say that, the original Kennedy property on the river, they too split up those huge floors. So this is what you did. You did away with this humongous floor, open floor concept, I guess? Well,
basically a show mart was a whole bunch of different little showrooms on a big floor. So you may have had 500 showrooms on one floor. What we did is we created very big blocks of space for big tenants. So we have, like, the head office of Rogers is there for the province of Quebec. We have TELUS, we have Great West Life. We have very large tenants that require a lot of back office space. And basically, for them to be all on one floor versus being on 5 floors in the typical building is a huge advantage from an operational point of view. So what we basically did is we took what was the disadvantage of the building and found out how could you make it an advantage. And that is a bit the trademark that we've done. We like building from scratch, but we also like to take what other people would consider a dog and finding a new vocation for it.
And that's how you get the upside too. It's like buying an undervalued stock.
Yeah, exactly like that.
And when you say we went looking for tenants that fit this or that criterion, how important is the sales force? Like, who goes looking with the satchel? Do you have great salesmen that can really see? Does that enter into it at all, or is it just price? And
no, it's basically you have to sell the concept, because basically you're selling something that no one has been able to see function before. So you got to give them a vision, and you got to get the right tenant that's going to be your first lead tenant, that's going to go in there and believe in what you're trying to do enough to basically accept that you're going to take down the ceiling and paint the concrete and make a funky space out of something that was not quite dilapidated, but as far as the finishes inside were dilapidated, dated, and were of another time versus today. So you had to make it funky for the young people that want to work there, because in this economy, in this city right now, it's all about technology, video games, and whatever you want.
Stuff, yeah.
So you've got to make the space attractive for that. So even in some of the space, we got graffiti artists to come and paint concrete walls to make the space funky. So that, you have to take a bit of a challenge that you'll be able to get people to do that. We did that here in 1998 in a recent building that we acquired, also vacant in Toronto on Bloor Street. We've done that this year, where we made the space funky for people to make it into for public relation firms. So again, you've got to create an environment and get people to believe in the environment. And then, funny enough, the demand comes.
Well, once the first one comes, I guess.
The first one is the key.
And you're talking about the aesthetics, making stuff funky and fitting the taste of the times. How big a bet are the aesthetics, and how big a necessity are spectacular aesthetics? Because we were used to, there have been fights in New York City with the Chippendale building, Philip Johnson, all the, these name architects doing something a little bit wild. But this is, you can't change it, you can't put a graffiti on it, it's the architecture.
Yeah.
You have a spectacular building called the Altoria, which sort of fits that. It's kind of a symbol and it's good looking. How important is that?
Well, basically, it's important. You gotta. In the case of Altoria, it's a mixed-use project that we're doing on a very prime public square. It's a 36-story building, which is a mixed use. It's a bit like Columbus Circle in New York, whereby you have many different functions in the same building. So having 5 like Columbus Circle, basically in this building we're going to have mainly office and a residential condo component on the top. Because this building is relatively high for Montreal standards for condos, basically what we wanted to do was create, number one thing was glass, views, a lot of windows, and then from there you basically refine the design to make it adaptable for the environment. But now today, to make a building LEED standards, that has a lot of impact on your design also. So you got to put it all together, but the main thing is really the services you're giving, the functionality of the building, and the environment of what you're selling. And in this case, it's views because of the location where nothing in front of it. It's a bit like Columbus Circle, not quite, but instead of having Central Park in front of it, we have a public square which guarantees you that no one's going to obstruct your views south, and you got a clear view to the mountain and a clear view to the river. And
you won't have that in Columbus Circle. They had that fight. Jackie Kennedy was the first to start it. The shadow cast on the park was a big problem.
Well, we had something similar to that here. Someone wanted to block our project because of causing a shadow on their building. Yeah. But basically, that was, how can we say it, they basically walked away from that challenge because there's no precedence of being able to stop someone from creating. No.
And everything casts a shadow.
Well, eventually a tree grows and it does cast a shadow. So, I mean, you can't stop someone from developing a piece of land they own for that.
And I also wondered, when people are holding a ball, a society ball, they're always nervous about the date. Sometimes it's planned a year or two ahead of time. They don't want some other ball across town on the same date, and they can't always know. When you're planning these, spectacular thing like this, you're assembling your plot of land. You're not telling everybody. How do you know there's not 4 other guys doing basically the same thing, and whoop, there'd be too many of them?
Well, as I said before, there's one big difference from 2011 than the early 80s, which is that there's discipline at the level of the financial institutions. So to be able to start a project like the Altoria project, you have to have a certain amount of pre-sales occurring. So you're not going to really start your project till you're at about a 60% sale level. Often on sites we'll be able to tie up a piece of land for the period of time to get our municipal zonings approved and all that, and you can start pre-selling in the final phases of that. So your risks are very calculated. You're really trying to learn from past mistakes of the early 80s and assure yourself that you're putting all of the components and making sure the risk of each component is manageable. As far as many other projects go, there's not that many projects in the delivery cycle of what we're doing. And the larger projects in this city anyways, they're kind of one behind each other. So there's one there's one just ahead of us. We're in one cycle, and we know what's coming behind us.
It's like airplanes taking off.
It's very similar to airplanes taking off.
But to get back to my other analogy, when tables don't sell, of course, people can cancel the ball. If you don't get your 60% pre-sale, do you maybe do you rethink a project?
Well, I will tell you that in the case of Altoria, the original selling of the project was going to happen in 2009. And that's what the timetable was. And basically what we had started pre-selling at that point in the spring of 2009, we quickly realized that with the financial uncertainties in the marketplace, we weren't going to be able to achieve our level. And we actually asked those that had purchased or are committed to purchase at that point to extend out by a few months their commitments, which allowed us then to be able to commit at the beginning of 2010. So it did take longer than anticipated because we never expected the market to fall in the fall of 2008 and the spring of 2009. So
obviously nobody did.
No one did, and what you do then is you got to go work with the person that owns the land and try and extend everything out because it's in everyone's interest for it to happen, right?
But is that why, for instance, in the Globe and Mail, it's been very amusing to follow the columns of Margaret Wente, because she bought a condo, and it's like it never seems to happen. And in her column, she says, well, don't ever think you'll get it when they say you're going to get it, because you'll never get it when they say you're going to get it. Is that a cliche or is that an exaggeration? But these kinds of things explain a bit the process. Developers have to stop and go. Meanwhile,
Toronto's a little different. There's a ton of speculation in the condo market in Toronto. There's probably 20 projects announced at the same time.
So it is overbuilt. There's an example, perhaps, of...
It may. The influx of immigration in Toronto is such that so far there hasn't been an overbuilt situation. I mean, even if people have predicted it over the years, it seems to always... There's a humongous influx. You're talking a city that 35% of the population wasn't born in Canada.
Yeah, it's true.
So it's a very large Asian immigration and everything else, and they're very big believers in real estate, and they will either buy the condos to use them as investment to rent them to new arrivals or to occupy themselves. So in her case, there are delays in Toronto because it depends on how long someone expects to sell out. In the case of Toronto, it's a different market. You can actually push out a project 24 months, the delivery on your buyers.
You're allowed?
Yeah, you're allowed based on most of the contracts they do. You can't get away with that in a city like Montreal. I mean, you've got to give a delivery date. You may be able to swing it a little bit, but you're not going to be able to swing it 24 months.
And another, not amusing, but kind of a folkloric thing that you could follow in the New York papers is assembling land. That used to be a sport, like Harry Helmsley and all these legendary people. They would set up dummy companies with ridiculous names and buy up land, and then one guy would figure it out who had land, a restaurant, and I'm never selling.
He was a holdout.
And then they would build around him in some cases. Is that game dead? Is it now more scientific, or is it still going on?
It's still going on. It still goes on. I mean, there's examples in every cities of buildings that you look at the way they were built and you say, there's something bizarre here. Here in Montreal, we had a famous site which was Ben's, which everyone remembered, the delicatessen that didn't want to sell and was offered the moon to sell, didn't sell. And in the end, they all died off, and the second generation
sold promptly.
Sold promptly, and someone developed that piece of land and
But if you look at the Russian Tea Room, the Russian Tea Room caused the building to be like a razor.
But it still happens, but in a city the size of a lot of our Canadian cities, it's a very small world that actually plays in real estate. And it becomes very difficult to play that game anymore because everyone kind of figures out who's trying to do what. And so maybe in large cities like New York, it can still take place, but in a city like here, it's not that easy to do that anymore.
And how about the quality of amenities inside? I was told by people who know these things that, for instance, Donald Trump, when he started, we might, ascribe a lot of faults to the guy and so on, but they said he was very, very smart and wise. He was the first to try all kinds of fancy, better amenities in each apartment, and that's how he made his name. It's not the rest. It's not all the hype and so on.
It's the quality of the product he delivered.
Yeah, but especially the amenities, the marble and this and that. Is there a big variation? Is that still a factor?
It's still a factor. It's an important factor. But once you get into a certain level, people are customizing their own apartments. So for the smaller units, depending on the price point, you will have a lot of that, which is a very key thing. But I would say that it's now much more uniform. There's no doubt that Trump, with the Trump Tower, and had set a standard, and people had expectations that got a lot higher than where they were before that occurred. And that's kind of been reflected across the board. I mean, Trump is building a Toronto building right now, so is Shangri-La, and the standards of those buildings are very comparable with the Ritz-Carlton that was just done. But in a lot of the cases also, it's the services after that are being offered. It's the quality of who's going to be managing it. Because if you go into the court system today, and especially in the US, where you don't really have reserve funds in condominium corporations, or at least not to the same extent that their legislation forces us to have it in Canada, you're finding buildings that are now requiring a fair bit of work. You're trying to collect the money from the owners, and the money's just not coming in. And that becomes a problem for the quality of the building. So a big thing now is how well is the building run? How well is it managed? Because your money's tied up in there.
Sure.
And you want to make sure that there's sufficient money in the reserve fund, that the building will always be properly maintained and everything else. In Florida, with the last downfall of the economy, there's a lot of buildings that are just occupied by tenants. Well, those apartments aren't going to generate too much to the reserve fund. So that's very important to a lot of people, to make sure that the building is properly managed, that the quality of the construction is such that it will last. I mean, there's been a lot of evolution on the condominium side, and on the office side, it's very similar. I mean, people want to make sure that the buildings are well built, that they're not going to have to pay down the road in a short period of time to replace a whole bunch of equipment. LEED standards has made it a very, it's a good guideline now to be able to know what's quality, what isn't, what is energy efficient building and everything else. So like our building that we're doing here is a LEED standard building, and others that we're working on are all LEED standard, because that's what is asked for now.
And finally, I think a builder is very similar to an architect. You dream, right? You dream. Do you still have a big dream building you'd like to do and haven't done yet?
I think you see a lot of things when you see parcels of land and whatever as to what can be done with them. But I think most of the energy that we put as far as dreaming goes is when we do actually lap onto a building or identify one, is really looking at it upside down and turning it every which way to Sunday to see. This building that we bought on Bloor Street in Toronto, it had a couple of little stores along Bloor Street, but the building had 10 stories of office space above. Margaret Wente lives above in the condominium building above.
Is that her thing? Yeah.
But basically down below, we wanted to make big stores and to bring out the Bloor Street facade, and but there was no way to do that because there were structural limitations or whatever else. Well, by rethinking the whole thing, we found other ways of dealing with the structure. We put in Louis Vuitton as their major Canadian store for a humongous flagship store in Toronto into the building, which totally changed the character of the whole building. So sometimes if you think long enough and you go crazy on your imaginations, you find ways of doing things that others thought weren't possible. And you totally turn around what a building was by creating a new identity for it. A bit like what Louis Vuitton did on Fifth Avenue is what we're basically doing with that building there.
All right. Well, Richard Hylands, you are a dreamer and a builder, so more power to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Richard Hylands of Kevric Corporation was our guest this week on Entrepreneurs, the Dobson series of the World Show. I'm Bob Scully. Have a great week. Thanks.